Do you remember the Alexander McQueen skull scarf? There are a handful of accessories in fashion history that have taken on a life of their own, like the Chanel two-tone ballet pump, the Dior saddlebag, the Vivienne Westwood orb necklace, and of course, the Alexander McQueen skull scarf. A high-fashion take on a Hot Topic staple, this thing was everywhere in the 2000s and 2010s, and if you opened up a magazine or scrolled on Tumblr, you were guaranteed to see at least one photo of it. But do you know how such a simple scarf became so popular, and why it's destined to make a return? In March 1992, a 23-year-old fashion student named Lee McQueen presented his master's collection thesis at Central St. Martin's. The show, titled Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims, drew inspiration from the infamous 19th century serial murders in London's East End. The garments were a haunting mix of beauty and brutality that pulled from history, art, and Lee's own troubled past, and the dark and dramatic direction would set the tone for what would become his signature style. Lee's entire reason for going to fashion school was so he could land an assistant position at an existing label, but despite his undeniable talent, no one would hire him. After the persistent badgering of his friends, he decided to launch his own label under his middle name, Alexander. Early reception towards Alexander McQueen was mixed, with praise being directed at Lee's tailoring and design philosophy, but criticism towards his dark direction and provocative imagery. Some early reviews even painted him as a misogynist because of the violence incorporated into his work, which was a clear misinterpretation of his intended message. But whether people loved him or hated him, they were talking about him, and in fashion, that's half the battle. And soon enough, Lee was purposely leaning into controversy, using shock value not just as an artistic statement, but as a form of marketing. By the mid-90s, the who's who in fashion knew of Alexander McQueen, but it wasn't translating to sales, and financially, Lee was holding on by a thread. In 1996, he reluctantly accepted the coveted position of head designer at Givenchy, a move made primarily so he could fund his own label's increasingly theatrical runway shows. This partnership was rocky from the start, and Lee's Givenchy era was lambasted by fans, critics, and even Hubert de Givenchy himself. Many of Lee's issues stemmed from creative differences with the brand's parent company, LVMH, who he considered over-involved in the design process, and the experience made him quite jaded towards the business side of the fashion industry. By 2000, he'd had enough, and he signed a deal with LVMH's direct competitor, Gucci Group, now known as Kering, who purchased a majority stake in Alexander McQueen for a rumored £50 million. With the Gucci Group's backing, Alexander McQueen had a lot more money and exposure, but it also brought with it a lot of changes, including the opening of several storefronts, a switch in show venues from London to Paris, and the increasing pressure to turn a profit. By this point, the major fashion houses had realized that runway shows were no longer a presentation of their products, but a form of advertising. And the bigger spectacle you created, the better. And making a spectacle was something that Lee knew how to do. For the label's spring 2003 ready-to-wear collection, Lee took inspiration from the 1986 film The Mission, which followed a group of Jesuit missionaries' attempts to protect an Amazonian tribe from European invaders in the mid-18th century. The collection was presented in 3 narrative sequences, beginning with a group of shipwrecked pirates that were followed by a legion of conquistadors and clergymen, before ending with an explosion of colorful tropical birds. The incorporation of historical elements was distinctly Lee, and with the clothing transitioning from sea to sky, it represented the metamorphic impact of trauma and the beauty of survival. The collection introduced the brand's now legendary oyster dress, which was Lee's reinterpretation of a design created by his fashion role model, John Galliano, back in 1987. The more well-known iteration of the oyster dress appeared during the show's shipwreck sequence, but a rainbow version was also made, and both were featured prominently in advertisements to promote the collection. But unexpectedly, it was a much simpler design that became the collection's breakout star and biggest moneymaker. Because of the show's nautical elements, the models were accessorized with skull-printed silk scarves inspired by pirate flags, which were then tied around ankles, tucked into belt loops, and hung off of purses. This direction was likely the brainchild of Katie England, who was Lee's right-hand woman from 1994 to 2007, where she worked as an assistant, model, muse, and stylist. She was one of the earliest adopters of Lee's designs, and in a 2002 article, she was recorded to be wearing, quote, an urban pirate look with old stripy Westwood trousers, a pair of high-heeled clogs, and a skull scarf tied at the waist. In June 2004, Lee returned to London to host a retrospective fashion show in celebration of his career. This Black show included archive Alexander McQueen pieces as well as new designs, one of which was a skull print scarf dress worn by none other than Kate Moss, one of the designer's closest friends. The skulls had been a rather small part of the 2003 collection, to the point that they were barely mentioned in reviews, but by including them in the Black show, it established that Lee saw them as one of his defining features, as they encapsulated the macabre direction he often gravitated towards, and they eventually became a symbol of the brand. Alexander McQueen was steadily becoming more and more mainstream, something credited to the efforts of the Gucci Group, who had opened up storefronts in multiple countries, launched the affordable diffusion line MCQ, and set up collaborations with other brands including Puma and MAC. As every fashion house can attest to, $1,000 haute couture dresses aren't actually that profitable. It's the accessories that pay the bills. And over the course of the 2000s, Alexander McQueen had started selling perfumes, sunglasses, and jewelry. But none of these items could compare to the success of the skull scarf. Although it had been available for a few years, the skull scarf didn't become a fashion phenomenon until 2006, where they were seen wrapped around the famous faces of Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, Nicole Richie, Ashley Simpson, Christina Aguilera, Lindsay Lohan, and even Kanye West. It spread from there and quickly became one of fashion's most coveted items, right alongside the Balenciaga City bag and the Tory Burch Riva flats. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but in fashion, it just means that what you're doing is working. And one publication even claimed that the skull scarf was the most knocked off trend of the year. For the first half of the 2000s, skulls weren't exactly the high fashion choice, being more associated with teenaged emos who hung out at Hot Topic, or douchey guys with a penchant for bedazzled Ed Hardy shirts. But in 2006, that perception shifted, with numerous publications citing pirate-inspired aesthetics as the year's hottest fashion trend. This was largely credited to Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest, which was the highest-grossing film of the year. And much like how the Barbie movie had everyone wearing hot pink for an entire summer, Pirates of the Caribbean had everyone wanting to dress like a swashbuckler. Now, in reality, we never went full pirate mode, but the skull scarf became a key feature of the growing indie sleaze aesthetic, right alongside skinny jeans, leather jackets, knee-high boots, and slouchy tops. Now, Alexander McQueen wasn't the only brand associated with skulls at the time, let alone the only one putting them on scarves, and one of their biggest competitors in the luxury space was Thomas Wilde, a Los Angeles-based brand that had been formed in 2005. Described as, quote, a feminine chrome hearts by founder Paula Thomas, their skull scarves were sported by many of the same people seen wearing the McQueen version. The two styles weren't identical, however, with Thomas Wilde featuring a more tight-knit skull design. But with a pretty comparable price point, without the same name recognition, they weren't able to compete for long, and Alexander McQueen was soon crowned the king of the skull scarf. In 2007, the Gucci Group announced that the label had finally turned a profit, something that was largely credited to the popularity of the scarves, with Lee saying in an interview, quote, "We've done about £1 million of business just on that scarf. I'd be quite happy to see it go, but the shops want them. I suppose they're like a new version of the Hermes scarf or something." In spite of Lee's lack of enthusiasm, the scarf continued to be released in a variety of colors and styles, and by the end of the decade, it had become one of Alexander McQueen's most recognizable products. Lee continued to incorporate skulls into his work, perhaps most notably in his spring 2009 ready-to-wear collection, Natural Distinction, Unnatural Selection. A commentary on humanity's negative impact on the environment, many of the designs incorporated digitally engineered prints featuring skeletons, further solidifying the association between the motif and the brand. But as with any trend, people were just about ready to move on from Alexander McQueen's skulls. But then, something dragged them back into the spotlight. On February 11, 2010, Lee McQueen unexpectedly passed away at the age of 40, throwing the fashion world into mourning. With the public looking for a way to honor and remember the legendary designer, and unsure whether or not the brand would continue, they scrambled to get their hands on anything that was identifiably Alexander McQueen. And in the days following his death, retailers reported that the brand had seen a 1,400% spike in sales, with the skull scarves even selling out completely. Keep in mind that we were all still feeling the impacts of the global recession, and the skull scarf was positioned as the perfect entry-level luxury accessory. At retail, they were sold for between $300 and $650, depending on the style, which might sound like a lot for a square of fabric, but compared to the prices of other Alexander McQueen offerings, it was a steal. The scarf effectively became a status symbol. implying that you were cultured enough to know what the brand was, but without having to shell out as much as you would for a purse or dress.
It's a bit tactless to wear glitz when people are worried about their jobs.
As the country goes from riches to rags, fashion designers are mirroring the darkness of the economy. A new minimalism is taking over. Solid colors, simple lines, and a classic look.
Normally it's like I want the funky shoes and the funky bag, and it's not like that anymore.
I still think women will always shop. You know, there's no holding back women from shopping. I just think that they'll go more for, you know, a product that will last longer. You won't really know what year it's from, so that you can wear it for 2-3 seasons.
Oh right, people have no money to buy these things, so how am I going to make them interested?
During an era where we wore the same thing to the office that we wore to the club, versatility was celebrated. And with the scarf having a print that appealed to either gender, and having the ability to be worn as a belt, bandana, or top, it became an early 2010s staple, especially in the fashion blogger scene, where it was a sort of holy grail purchase. Because of this renewed popularity, celebrities like Nicole Richie, Ashley Simpson, and Christina Aguilera dug their old skull scarves out of storage, while some newer faces like Kim Kardashian, Carrie Underwood, Harry Styles, and Ashley Tisdale were seen sporting it as well. Whether they were paying homage to the designer or capitalizing on his absence, other fashion houses began exploring skeletal motifs in their work, and soon enough they were all over the runways. As is customary, the trend trickled into fast fashion, and in the early 2010s, it was pretty common to see ribcage sweaters, skull print skater dresses, and leg bone leggings. Of course, the skull scarf itself was also duped pretty blatantly, with everyone from Topshop to Target having their own affordable version. And these were so popular that a lot of people who owned them didn't even know they were based on a design by Alexander McQueen. This was the final nail in the coffin, and the once edgy accessory was now fully mainstream. And like anything that's overexposed and oversaturated, it went from being cool to being basic. In 2013, to mark the scarf's 10th anniversary, Alexander McQueen collaborated with artist Damien Hirst on a limited edition collection featuring an assortment of insects arranged into abstract skull shapes, emphasizing how large a presence the accessory had within the brand. 2 years later, Kate Moss re-wore her original skull dress from 2004 to the opening of the Savage Beauty exhibition in London, which was a celebration of Lee's work. But by then, the skull scarf was already dead and buried in fashion's graveyard. 2000s fashion trends have been incredibly influential on the 2020s. Just look at the return of Ugg boots and low-rise jeans. And as the decade progresses, so will its references. With that in mind, it's no surprise that the skull scarf is slowly starting to creep its way back into the public eye, almost exactly 2 decades after it was first popularized. For Alexander McQueen's Fall 2025 ready-to-wear show, the brand's current creative director, Sean McGeer, paid homage to its founder by bringing back the iconic skull print on scarves and shirts, and I wouldn't be surprised if it makes some more appearances in subsequent collections. Although the scarves are still being sold at Alexander McQueen, early adopters on social media have gotten their hands on vintage versions. Because yes, the originals would be considered vintage by now. And I feel like there are only a few months left until prices skyrocket, especially considering that they've started showing up on celebrities again. In early 2025, Timothée Chalamet was seen wearing a handful of skull scarves while promoting a complete unknown. And I do think it's funny that 2 of the people he's dated, Kylie Jenner and Lourdes Leon, had worn them back in the 2010s. What goes around really does come back around. At the 2025 Glastonbury Festival, Charli XCX wore a custom Alexander McQueen skull scarf top, which felt like a fun throwback to the 2000s indie sleaze vibes her Brat album pulls from, and it definitely proved that you could still do something new with such an old trend. Regardless of how oversaturated the skull scarf became, I think a lot of people will be charmed by its return, because as we've seen, nostalgia is a powerful thing. Let's just hope that it doesn't mean another recession is on the way. What are your thoughts on the Alexander McQueen skull scarf? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!